This is the fourth and final webinar of the Democracy Rebooted series, Deliberative Responses to Planetary Challenges. It's the second time we're running Democracy Rebooted. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that this is translated into Spanish. So if you want to read along in Spanish, then you can go at the bottom at the globe symbol, the international thingy, and then you can turn to Spanish. So this series, the Democracy Rebooted series, is a collaboration between the ECPR Standing Group on Democratic Innovations, the APSA Democratic Innovations Related Group, the Red Politologas, sorry for butchering this name in English, and the PDD group. So that's the group I'm from. It's the PSA, Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Group. I'd like to say that Azucena Moran has organized most of this in collaboration with the group. So she's the mastermind behind this series. I'm very grateful that she put this effort forward. She pulled all of this together. So a big round of virtual applause to Azucena. So in the series so far, we're talking about planetary challenges. We've heard about authoritarianism, about decolonizing, and climate transition. And so Azucena and I talked a bit and at the beginning of the series, and we asked what from a participatory and deliberative democracy perspective is one of the really big planetary challenges to democracy. And we said that non-human participation might be one of the biggest challenges and biggest issues today. So how can non-human animals participate in democracy? And we're so delighted and so happy that we can welcome Eva Meijer here, who is going to be in conversation with Lucy Parry. Eva Meijer is an artist, writer, philosopher, and singer-songwriter. Her work focuses on interspecies democracy and non-human animal languages, and her work has been translated into over 20 languages. I think all of them are human, but we will hear lots about non-human languages today. Lucy Parry is a senior research associate at the Center of Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance in Canberra. Her research focuses on deliberative democracy, deliberative systems, in particular, democratic innovations, and animal ethics. And I've forgotten to introduce myself. My name is Hans Asenbaum. I'm also here at the Center for Deliberative Democracy, like Lucy. So I'm very happy to host this session, and I'm going to hand over to Lucy and Eva for the conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hans. And thank you, Eva, for joining us. It's actually a few years since I was actively working on non-human animals. So it was really nice to kind of look into your work and revisit that area of my own research a little bit. So it's got me kind of reflecting and making some notes and so on. So that was really great. So the first question that I wanted to ask you was if you could tell us a little bit of, I guess, your origin story, or how you came to be working on this topic. What kind of brought you to it?
Thank you. Thanks, Lucy. It's interesting because when you're speaking, there's a black shape moving up and down, which is probably not human. Oh, no,
yes, it's a small cat.
Yes, first of all, thanks a lot, Azucena and Hans, for inviting me, and you, Lucy, for this question and the questions to follow, and everybody who's here to join us in the conversation. Yeah, my origin story, there are always multiple origin stories, but when it comes to animals and democracy, I think that it's a combination of the experiences that I had with non-human animals, or more than human animals, other than human animals. There are different names when I was growing up, and there were always cats, mostly guinea pigs. I had a horse when I was a child, and I was very accustomed to just casually communicating with them, listening to them, and also very aware of the fact that they have plans and perspectives, viewpoints, ideas. So when I began to study philosophy, it was soon clear that philosophy is mostly a case of humans thinking about humans, or at least it has been like that for a very long time. And then human is also, of course, narrowly defined, as we all know. And I became interested in animal ethics because for me, the relations with animals were always a matter of justice, and I felt bad about injustice and wanted to know more about what kind of reasons humans have to treat animals so badly. So I ended up reading the standard animal ethics literature, Peter Singer, Tom Regan, all of these folks, but missed the animal's perspective in this. As I continued studying, I of course encountered Donna Haraway and also other fields like animal geography, in which animal agency is taken more seriously. I always also had an interest for studies in biology and ethology that focus on animal capacities or things that they can do. So there was a bit of a clash, I felt, between how in philosophy animals are presented as objects, even in animal ethics, where they're very often considered as objects of thought. How should we humans treat the other animals? And everything I knew from my own experience, but also all of the studies that appear daily about what animals do and can and remember and feel, the kind of cultures they have, the kind of languages they have, their emotions, all of these things. And I felt that this was an interesting tension and also something to figure out philosophically. So what does language, for example, mean when you think about the multitude of ways in which other animals express themselves, not just with sounds, but also with colors or scent or gestures? What does that mean for how we view language? And then at the same point, as I was writing my master's thesis, a book came out called Zoopolis by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, in which they put forward a political theory of animal rights. So they explicitly argue that non-human animals should be seen as political actors, political communities, and that we should formulate new political relationships with them, not on the basis of their species membership or their individual capacities, but as social groups. So that was also formative in the work that I went on to do.
Great, thank you. And I think, yeah, for a lot of people working in this field, that book was kind of a game changer in reorienting a lot of the debates and conversations and so on. We can post that in the chat later, actually, if anybody's interested. So the next question is a bit of a big question because you have a whole book about it, really. But I'm going to ask you to try and summarize if you can. If you could explain your vision or argument for interspecies democracy that you lay out in your book, When Animals Speak, which I have here, courtesy of Hans. Thank you. And perhaps especially explain or delineate it from the existing approaches in the political turn in animal ethics that you already mentioned. I'm not sure how many of our audience are familiar with this field in general. I think we have people maybe coming more from the deliberative and democracy side rather than the animal side. So if you could just give a kind of an outline of your argument and what makes it distinct from the previous work, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I will begin with language. There are many studies in biology and ethology that focus on linguistic capacities of animals. And generally, these scientists focus on one aspect of the language of one animal. So, for example, many animals have names, dolphins and parrots and bats, they all use names, they give them to their children. These animals have them for their whole lives. But then many biologists would focus on one species and then one, only the name giving. Another example is grammar. Grammar is often seen as something that's specific to human language, but many scientists are doing work on the grammar of animal languages. For example, songbirds have complex structures in their songs that can be compared to how language works in the human case. Also, completely different kinds of animals like Caribbean reef squid, who communicate with color on the sides of their bodies. These color patterns, changing color patterns on their skin, also have a simple grammar, or at least a structure that can be compared to human grammar. And then these scientists are studying that. And this is a pattern. This is true for many, many animals. So when I became interested in the question of animals and language, I read many of these studies, and my idea of language changed. I turned to the later Wittgenstein for methodological guidance, because I think that his concept language games is very suitable for thinking about the languages of other animals. It's embodied, situated. Wittgenstein writes that words gain their meaning within a social context that you need to know in order to appreciate fully. And I think that, I mean, there's more aspects. It's open-ended. There can always be new language games. And I think it's suitable for thinking about the languages of other animals, because it allows us to recognize their agency, to not predefine what counts as language, because humans like to predefine based on human capacities, which is problematic. And I think it's also suitable for thinking about linguistic encounters between humans and other animals. While it may not be perfect, it at least allows us to think about these interactions in a way that enables us to further study animal languages non-violently. So that is one thing. Then the second thing is, and that's a big political point, is that animals are not recognized as speaking beings. They're not recognized as political beings, even though they form their own communities, have social norms within their communities, social animals, but also animals who live solo. They usually also communicate with one another, but in different ways. And they are part of our communities, and humans exploit them on a great scale in all the practices that we see as exploitation, but also in other ways, and we find it very normal. And the fact that animals are not recognized as linguistic and political agents, are not recognized as co-beings with whom we might form communities, or at least share a planet, because we live in a day and age in which we cannot separate our lives. I mean, it would be great if we could leave the animals, but I think that's empirically completely impossible. And I also think that good relations are possible, better relations. And it's this is a political question in itself, the question of who has language and who has not. We know that from human movements too, and from marginalized human groups, the question of language, who speaks, who has a voice, all of these things are determined by power relations. And even when there are formal rights for a group, say women, there are still problems with acknowledging their voice at certain points related to earlier oppression. So the question of who speaks is deeply political in itself. Animals speak in their own ways to each other and to us, but it's not recognized by us as and us is difficult as well, but at least human political societies in most parts, if not all parts of the world, even though certain indigenous communities do a lot better in recognizing them as speaking beings and also forming their own communities. But within the Western paradigm of knowledge, there's epistemic violence, epistemic oppression, which is connected to real life political oppression. And what you find also is that it's not an empirical question whether or not animals speak. How they speak might be in some senses an empirical question, but similar to how this works in the human case, but research and animal research has for centuries measured the worth of other animals on the basis of how much they resemble humans. And this is very clear in the language research again, because animals were used to study human language, but not their languages, or in order to find out better relations. So the thing is, in the political turn in animal philosophy, certain political philosophers simply say, okay, we need to take animal interests into account into political decision making. This sort of stays within the existing framework. Others say no, because they have the fact that they have a perspective on life, on our communities, on our shared lands, habitats, and so on, has normative value. So we should take their voices or perspectives into account, perhaps through translating that or making use of science or whatever methods there may be, or through establishing new kinds of political experiments, but we can talk about that a little bit more. And I think that the question of language has been underexplored even in the latter turn that recognizes animal agency, because language is so, for humans, really equated with a human language. At the same time, we communicate with other animals all the time. So it's not as if I'm proposing something, I do think we need to learn how to do this better, but I'm not proposing something weird. It's just that we don't recognize it, but we do it all the time. So my contribution to the field of animal political philosophy has to do with language and intersubjectivity, and centralizing the perspectives of the other animals in forming new kinds of democratic assemblages, communities, structures that can help us both in making the existing system less anthropocentric by including their voices, but that also in a next step might open up the way for new democratic practices. So, and a last point about this non-anthropocentric way of doing politics or democracy, I think that is something that is necessary for countering the great ecological crisis that we are facing these days, loss of biodiversity, the climate crisis, because it really means decentering the human. And I think that is why, so usually you're not, I mean, for a long time, I think people who did work on animals in philosophy were not taken so seriously. It's always kind of like the thing that's like, well, you know, the serious stuff happens with the humans, but then the animals are a bit like, yeah, that's the weird, they're sentimental. But I think now that's changing a lot. And I actually feel that that's related to this other regardingness that's kind of built into animal ethics and animal rights philosophy. I mean, the animal philosophers are very much, I think, focused on the other animals. And I think that, I mean, of course, we need to do lots of things to counter the climate crisis, but I also really, really think that we need to change our attitude as humans. So turning towards the other animals, listening to what they have to say, all of these kinds of things can help us. Furthermore, other animals are generally better at using the planet in sustainable ways. They usually do not take more than they need and keep their habitats flourishing and so on.
Thank you, Eva. Now, just to kind of flesh that out a little bit more, perhaps flesh is the wrong word to use there. In your book, you give lots of really rich examples and illustrations of what interspecies deliberation and participation looks like. And I was wondering if you could share maybe one or two of those examples, because just to make it a bit more tangible what you're talking about, because I remember when I first started my PhD, someone said to me, oh, you want to give crows the vote, right? And that's what they understood as democratic participation of other animals. So I wonder if you could share one or two of your examples to make that a little bit more tangible, what we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, well, many animals actually do vote in their own species-specific ways, but I agree that this is always the thing that people talk about when they, but it's also a very narrow conception of politics, right? This is what specifically those of us working in deliberation know a lot about. But so in the book, I discuss certain case studies. I discuss learning to live with a street dog from Romania, Oli, which is very much about establishing a common language and a common, which is connected to establishing a common life world. But from the perspective of politics, I also discuss a case study of wild geese. In the Netherlands, there's a problem with wild geese. I mean, the Dutch are always, when there are too many animals of a certain species, they will go and kill them. We have little tolerance for animals in this country. The Dutch are used to, I think, control everything a lot. So that's the first thing that they will undertake. And with the geese, it's very problematic because they were invited to come to the Netherlands. There's a big nature reserve in the middle of the country, the Oostvaardersplassen, and geese were specifically attracted by the plants that were planted in order to keep trees from growing because they eat the new sprouts and everything. So this was one of the factors. While there are now a lot of these, also the way in which the fertilizers that farmers use to make the grass grow, the ban on or the hunting of foxes that used to be banned, but then it wasn't, so there are not enough foxes. And these geese, for example, live near Schiphol Airport, but also near farms, and people began shooting them. This does not help because geese they fly. So when they see beautiful green fields that are lush and wonderful, they think, wow, I'm going to live here, or at least rest for a little bit. And there are also lots of neighborhoods, like the suburbs in the Netherlands are also great for them because they have lots of water and grass. And what you find is, if you look at the relationships between farmers, activists, politicians, citizens, and geese, that there are many practices of deliberation. So between these human beings, there's protest, conversation, policy making. There are different ways in which conversations are had about the geese, but there are also conversations with the geese, for example, between farmers and geese. They might make the land attractive, or throw a little bit of soil over the plants that they planted and make it unattractive. They can also make other parts of the land more attractive for them. There are also physical encounters. People scare away the geese, or on the other hand, activists might help them and rescue them. So in official politics, the voices of the humans and the interactions there are recognized, but those with the geese are not. And it would be helpful, at least for the geese, but also for the human beings, if we saw these interactions as forms of deliberation, because geese are smart animals. They learn throughout their lives. They pass on knowledge to others as well. So this could establish more sustainable relations with them. Of course, there are all kinds of other normative questions related to this, such as who owns the land, because now humans think they own the land and the geese also think they own the land, but then the humans shoot them. So it's, but this is just one example in which humans and other animals have political interactions that can be improved. There's a goose biologist, Maarten Lonen, that has I don't know, experience with dealing with geese and teaching them things. And yeah, so this is a very small scale situation in which it can be done differently. Then there's a last example that I will mention briefly, and that is that there's a lot of work being done right now in animal sanctuaries, for example, in farmed animal sanctuaries, places where rescued farmed animals or animals who escaped from slaughter live and form collectives. And some of these sanctuaries understand themselves as multi-species communities and invest a lot of time not simply in taking care of the animals or fixing life for them in some sense, but really figuring out the hard questions of who wants to live where, what kind of life do these animals want from us, and what can we offer them. An example is Vine Sanctuary in Vermont, and there the cows, for example, have three different areas where they can choose to live, either near to the farm or a little bit farther away, or up in the mountains away from the humans. And yeah, through these kind of spatial interventions, because if we think about deliberation with animals or any kind of conversation with animals, it's going to have to take time. We have to think about it more as a process than as a voting thing, like say yes or no now. You know, we need to figure out things by having long, slow conversations. Embodied. The embodiedness and the situatedness of the encounters is important, and also the places where these conversations take place, because I think that humans very often envision animals coming into perhaps human official political spaces. There are many of these images as well of chimpanzees in parliament, or these kinds of drawings you get when it's about animals in politics. But very often the scale on which dialogues make sense for other animals is the local scale. And of course, there are traveling animals who have a different different view of that. But at least in these animal sanctuaries, the space plays an important role. Other things also matter, like habits. What kind of habits do the animals have? What kind of new habits do humans and other animals form? I think that one last remark, that when we think about concepts such as language, politics, deliberation in relation to other animals, it's never just about thinking about how they might apply it to animals. I mean, I think that political concepts can clarify relationships. They're very helpful tools, but it's always also about reinterpreting them in a multi-species way. So we can begin with the human concept, deliberation, and I think that when you look at deliberative theory, there's also a move towards the more than human in many different ways, and the sort of a critique of the human as autonomous, rational, the earlier image of the human. So there's already space for that there to see, hey, what does this mean? But then it's also really up to the animals. What are they going to do? How do interactions work out? Yeah, and maybe many animals will not want to deliberate with us in the end. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind as well, because right now we force so much on them. But there are also some examples of humans who either live with animals or with wild animals and establish kinds of relations with them, or study them that are showing that, yes, they are eager, certain animals are eager to seek out contact with humans as well.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask one last question before I turn it back over to Hans and the audience for any further questions. So I wanted to ask you about the role of representation in your work. So in my own work, I was interested in how kind of human representation of other animals' interests could help secure better outcomes for other animals. rather than interspecies deliberation and direct participation of other animals, as you talk about. But I would say I also don't see them as mutually exclusive. And I think especially as you describe, a lot of these interactions are kind of localized and site-based interactions, they're embodied. And I'm thinking about the gap between these local level interactions and sort of national level policy making and so on. And for me, I think that we still need human representation of other animals' interests and preferences there. So I was wondering if you could say something about representation and where, if it fits into your argument.
Thanks. I think that there are different answers to give to this question. So from a pragmatic point of view, I don't think that right now there's so first of all, the situation for the animals is really, really bad. So I think that we need everything that we have in order to improve it. And we can't, I mean, it's just impossible to say, oh, we shouldn't do that for normative reasons if it can improve the lives of animals. There is a problem that immediately comes to mind, and that is that when you think about humans representing other animals, this keeps intact the idea that animals cannot speak for themselves, and that humans are somehow better able to articulate their position towards other humans. And while it is sometimes necessary to speak for others if they have no voice in a given situation, in order to get their problems on the agenda, it should always also be informed by speaking with these others. And I think that we know this from the human case as well. In the Netherlands, we have a political party called the Party for the Animals. And they're actually not only a party for the animals, because they started out 20 years ago as really a party for the animals, you know, putting animal questions on the agenda all the time. But now they really present a holistic view for society, saying that we do not need more economic growth, but we need to treat the planet better, and including the vulnerable, such as non-human animals, but also children, because for them there's much more at stake than for adults at this point in time, and marginalized communities. But also, I mean, in the Netherlands, the Dutch are a great importer of soy from Brazil. We're actually, after China, the second importer of soy, which means that the rainforest in Brazil is cut down for animal feed in the Netherlands, because over 95% of soy is used to feed the animals. So these kinds of things, and which is of course very harmful for the rainforest, for indigenous human communities, for animal communities living there. So it's all connected. And I think that the Party for the Animals does a really good job sort of hijacking politics from the inside out, because they really want to move past the idea that existing parliamentary politics is a matter of struggle and conflict and getting as much voters as you can for 4 years and then seeing whatever you will do. So they present an alternative. And I think that they show that human representation of animals, but also this proposal of doing politics differently can make a change, because the discourse also changes. And I think that in many questions of representation, there's also a cultural component involved. How do we change the narrative? How do we change the narrative about the future, but also about animals? And I think that the same applies to going to court for animals, doing all the stuff that was usually only done for humans, now doing it also for the other animals. Even writing about them, about their acts of resistance. There's now a nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands, so we need to think about farming. And the animals' perspective is again not taken into account. It's mostly because of dairy cows, of dairy cow farming, that this problem exists. So even writing about their perspective, bringing it into the debate about it as a human helps to to change the discourse and the narrative. But I think it is important in all of these steps, because we have this huge human system. I mean, we're not going to be able to change it single-handedly. I have a bit of optimism with regard to the younger generation and a bit of optimism with regard to academia. But I think that there are very strong also economic forces at work that make change very difficult. So yeah, we need all of it. But yeah, representation can make a difference. But there is a problem, and that is connected to what I was saying before about science and the human bias in animal science. Vinciane Desprez wrote a book called What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions? And in this, she studied ethologists. So she studied the people who study animals, and shows that very often the studies that they do are formed by specific stereotypes and biases and all of that with regard to the other animals. And I think in speaking for animals, of course we need to do this sometimes, but activists and others who represent the animals should really know the people they represent, you know, because otherwise they will perpetuate harmful stereotypes about them. And that's the, you know, the great emphasis on suffering, which is true because they suffer greatly. But there's been in the whole animal rights discourse a great emphasis on suffering, and that already portrays other animals as kind of, yeah, somewhere between passive and active, and somewhere between object and subject. And of course, we don't need to, they don't need to do anything in order to be taken into account, but it's how the words that we use to speak about them and the way in which they are portrayed matters greatly in working towards change. I mean, apart from the whole thing that they do speak for themselves all the time and also have their own ideas, and you know, many animals don't want humans to speak for them. But yeah, as you rightly say, we are in this system where we also need to do that.
Thank you, Eva. Now I have lots more potential questions I could ask, but I'm going to hand back over to Hans and everybody else. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Lucy. That was a fascinating conversation. I'm sure there are lots of questions. So if you would like to ask a question, just virtually raise your hand. I'm sure, yeah, I'll see many claps. So I'll see that you know how to raise your hand. If you go down to the reactions, you can raise your hand, and then we'll take it from there.
There was also already someone posted a question in the chat earlier, Hans. I don't know if that person wants to.
I saw it, yes. We can take the question first while you think about your questions. So Harald Thronholst, again, probably a weird English pronunciation, sorry, asks, if Eva, in your work, you differentiate between domesticated and non-domesticated animals, so does that make a difference for communication and animal language, I guess? And also, if we should then further differentiate within domesticated animals between pets like dogs and cats, and cows and sheep and horses, so other types of domesticated animals.
Thanks. Yes, that matters a lot, I think, but it's so Donaldson and Kimlicka in their book Zoopolis really make a strong distinction between relationships with domesticated animals that they propose to view as citizens, wild animals, so those who really don't want anything to do with humans, like deer or lions or wild mice. And they propose to view these as sovereign communities. And then they distinguish a third group that they call liminal animals. So those are the animals who are not domesticated but live amongst humans, like crows or rats in the city. And they argue that these should be seen as denizens, and all of these animals should have full negative rights, such as the right not to be killed, held captive, exploited by humans. But in addition to that, they have specific rights connected to the category that they belong to. And they argue that domesticated animals are in a position to communicate well with humans, precisely because of their shared history with humans. And I think that this model of Donaldson and Kymlicka is, on the one hand, useful because it makes clear that some animals seek out relationships with humans and others not, and that it's easier to form communities with certain animals and difficult to form communities with other animals. But at the same time, if we begin to change our relationships with other animals, so this means ending their exploitation. So this means ending the whole farm industry as it exists now, same for laboratories, ending hunting, all of these practices, then these categories will soon, in a couple of generations, become very muddled, because dogs apparently are fully wild again after 4 generations. So if dogs are left to fend for themselves and then afterwards humans retreat, they become wild again. Certain animals might not survive because they are really sort of made by humans, bred by humans for human purposes, and then we should take good care of them, of course, of the ones who live, but and then also the wild animals, who are now generally afraid of humans because of human violence, will cease to be afraid. Because, I mean, if we are not being so violent, then there's also literature showing that when a predator is removed from a certain area or dies out or something, the animals forget in a couple of generations to be afraid of this predator. And if they then reintroduce them, they need to become afraid again by witnessing the violence. So when we think about the future, yes, I think these animals of different social groups need and have a right to different kinds of political representation, especially in this phase from now to a better society. But I also think that it will change a lot. So there are, and I also think that for humans, we will also change. You know, it's also, if we are going to share the world more justly with other animals and share the land more justly with them, this also will change our outlook on life.
Thanks a lot. So we have a question from Ramon. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot, Eva, for the interesting talk. I just have a short, informative question. You said after you introduced, that we could translate animals' views via science and the like. You said, or via all kinds of political experiments, and you said we could go into that later. So I was wondering what you had in mind, and if you could point me in some kind of direction on where I can find these political experiments.
Yeah, I think that that's the stuff that I was talking about in sanctuaries, and also certain, I mean, there's in the whole of animal studies, precisely because science has been biased for so long, a kind of trend in which scientists who are maybe not trained as ethnographers use auto-ethnography to write about relations with their own companions. Like I, for example, wrote about the relations with Ollie, and the other, I live with ex-laboratory mice, for example, so I've also written a paper about them. And so there are a lot of micro experiments at homes of researchers and in sanctuaries that are looking at political relations, political conversations, sometimes forming co-governments with other animals. And yeah, that was the type of literature that I was referring to. And if you send an email, I can also recommend some papers or write them in the chat, but I'm a bit slow recovering from COVID. So typing and talking is not in my capacities right now, but yeah.
Thank you, Eva. So we have another question in the chat. Alfonso Donoso asks from a library, so he can participate verbally. I wonder whether you think that there are individual humans or groups of humans that are better prepared to listen to other animals. What's the role they should have in political representation of these animals? In other words, are there experts in listening to the voices of non-human animals? Who are these experts? And what role should they have in interspecies politics?
Well, I think I very briefly mentioned that many indigenous communities around the world have different cosmologies and see the position of the human differently within the greater whole. So instead of seeing the human on top of a pyramid and then the rest sort of beneath that, some higher animals, and then and then the plants somewhere down or something, or they view humans as more embedded, or as completely embedded in nature, and also view other animals as their own, forming their own communities. And I think that this perspective is useful for countering our sort of narcissistic humanness in a sense. So yeah, and specific communities, of course, do this differently and have also different, because these cosmologies and ideas are not always, I mean, they have different relations to the other animals. But this is, I think, an important alternative on a huge scale all over the world. And then I think that the question of experts is generally quite tricky, as we saw in the discussion of animal science. But I do feel that specifically when it comes to political representation, there are certain institutes that we already have that are aimed at speaking about others. For example, in the Netherlands, we have an ombudsman, ombudshuman to represent children. And there's also somebody working on developing that for animals right now. There's also a labor union now in the Netherlands representing the rights of certain animals in farming. And you see that work rights are generally, work rights for non-human animals are kind of a trend. So lots of people are thinking about that in different countries. And over there, I think that it's sort of a going back and forth between the knowledge that people from the field have about working with these animals and ideas about human labor unions, and humans try to fit those together. So I do feel that when it comes to representation, there is a role for experts, but knowledge is, we need to also be very critical about the kind of knowledge that has been generated and that also is generated, because what happens too sometimes is that it's quite fashionable also to, I mean, animals are hip sort of now in the in academia. So it's also very important to again here to stay in touch with the actual animals and people who have knowledge also for academics from the ground, and yeah, know what's happening. And I think, I mean, when it comes to experts, all of what I know, I've learned from the other animals. You know, I mentioned the laboratory mice. Mice are not mice. People think about mice as these kind of, I don't know, simple proto-humans. And this is also how they're spoken about in scientific discourse and studied. And then when I began to live with them, I saw that they have lots of practices of care. When someone's ill, the others sit with her, and they take very good care of each other. They have a huge vocabulary in voice, but also facial expressions and many things. And they're just full beings who live very short lives. So I feel that this kind of existential, personal level also matters when it comes to not simply having knowledge, but allowing yourself to be transformed by the knowledge. Because when you begin to see animals for what they really are, this will change your view of life and of the world too.
Thank you, Eva. So we have one question from Michael Sayward and one question from Graham Smith. And I wonder if you would like to unmute yourself and share the questions with us rather than me reading it, which is much more boring. We'd love to see you if you can. And we can take both of these questions together and then have a response from Eva, and then we're getting closer to the end anyway. So Michael, do you want to come on, or would you like me to read the question? So from the silence, I deduce that I'm supposed to read the question, which I will do. So many praising words for...
Hans,
yes.
Mike is trying to speak. He's just, for some reason, his mic's not working.
Oh.
I'm so sorry, Hans.
Oh, it's working now.
It's working. Sorry about that.
Great.
Thank you so much, Eva, and to your questioners. I mean, that was just a superb discussion. I have a very small question. It seemed like the notion of rewilding, I don't think you used the word, Eva, but it kind of hovered in the background of several examples you gave and some expressions of your broader philosophy and the questioning you bring to the notion of democracy. So it's really just an open-ended question. To what extent, perhaps in what ways, does this, again, quite kind of trendy notion of rewilding play a role in your philosophy, in your thinking about democracy and other aspects of what you're talking about?
Right, and Graham could add to this.
You're muted, Graham.
Of course I am, Mike. Right. So I was thinking almost a similar thing to Michael, although I don't want to subvert his question too much, which was about the discussions about reintroducing predatory species, etc. And one of the reasons I bring this up, and I'm someone who was trying to write about this sort of stuff about 20 years ago when no one was interested. So I completely appreciate that where you are now. It's really great. And one of the things that we used to get really stuck on was this question about whether we should be privileging ecosystems, species, or individuals. And that becomes a really critical question when you start to think about reintroducing or inverted commas, introducing species that have been removed at various points. And I'm quite interested to know how you respond to that question. And it becomes a very pertinent question when you start thinking about the kind of political experiments that Ramon was talking about, because I'm someone, and I don't want to, everyone's bored with me talking about this, but I do a lot of work on citizens' assemblies. And we've been thinking about what it means to have non-human participation within those assemblies. And it does often come down to that question about, well, what sort of entity are we talking about? Are we talking about a system? Are we talking about a species? Are we talking about a particular individuals or a particular group in a particular setting? So so building on some of what Mike said, I'd just be interested to know your thoughts in that direction. But thank you, and again, thank you. This has been really interesting and really refreshing.
Thank you, Michael and Graham, for these questions. Yes, these are very much about the future also, and also pragmatic. So I think the notion of rewilding was very long connected to a sort of romantic idea of humans wanting to return nature to itself, you know, to kind of create, okay, what was there? And there's something very aesthetic about it, and also ethical. I mean, I think that probably these rewilders have this idea of, okay, nature has a value in itself, and there's something, but the humans are composing it. And I think that when it comes to rewilding in this context, it's a lot about asking the animals how they see this composition, and not asking them beforehand, but by doing it. And very often, again here, I think that this category of liminal animals that Donaldson and Kimlicka come up with, under the conditions of the Anthropocene, many animals will be liminal in the end. I'm not sure if we, I mean, this earlier idea of nature needs to be, but then of course, we know this from feminist theory as well, that all the ideas of nature are problematic, also distinctions between nature and culture. But yeah, what does it mean to think about rewilding and taking into account the animals' perspectives in that? I think that's really one of the questions that we have for the future, and one that's very difficult to experiment with because we don't have the space for it. But I do know that many individual animals and also animal communities are flexible and can change roles. So I live with two dogs who were formerly liminal and are now living in a house. They're not domesticated, but they adopted this new role of living in a house. And I do a lot of bird rescuing, so then they are, I mean, especially birds like pigeons are quite okay with changing the role for a bit and then going, I mean, sometimes they hate it, but yeah, they often go, and then they go out into the world again. So I think animals can take on different roles in this process of rewilding, but it's a really important question and one that I don't have a good answer to. I do think that liminal animals have more self-determination or autonomy than domesticated animals, and that's valuable in a sense. And then the other question that is indeed connected to it, so what is the locus of consideration? Is it ecosystem, species, or individual? And I think that, for example, when you work in a bird shelter, I've worked in bird shelters, these questions are very much there because they are about humans make decisions all the time, which animals belong where and why, and what should they say. But I think that for too long, the focus has been either on ecosystems, species, or individuals, and not enough on the social relations that humans right now have with these other animals. And from these social relations, different human duties follow. So we have different duties towards pigs or dogs, and the dogs are not one group. You know, there are many. There are the really bred dogs, even sometimes with difficulties, but there are also the liminal dogs and even the wild dogs. Rabbits is another example of a species that has all of these different roles. But I do feel that specifically when you discuss the future of a community, like in a citizens assemblages and things, you need to, I think that these social and political relations are can be helpful sometimes. These are lenses that we apply to certain situations. So maybe there will be circumstances when you need to decide about species. Do we rescue the seals or do we rescue the fish? What kind of ethical question is that? But then there's also the question of living together with others in a city, and then other questions might be at stake. So perhaps these and what kind of right do domesticated animals have to the city and the green spaces and all of these things? So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Thanks
a lot, Eva. Lucy, do you maybe have any concluding reflections, ideas that you want to share before we close the meeting?
I could add to that point about the sort of conservation ecosystems and individuals, because it's also something that I've thought about in the past, but that would take too long. So I won't add additional reflections. I would just, again, say thanks to Eva and thanks to everyone for participating, and Asenbaum and Hans for organizing. It's been a really great conversation. And as I said, I've really enjoyed revisiting some of these topics. If anyone's interested in kind of further pursuing this type of conversation, I do have with a group of people an as yet unfunded project proposal, which is about how can we enhance participation of other animals in existing democratic decision-making processes. So feel free to drop me a line if anyone is interested in finding out more about that as well. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So before we close, I just wanted to share an invitation with you. We're tomorrow launching our book, Research Methods in Deliberative Democracy. It's tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock European time, and 8 o'clock in the morning in the UK. So that's research, lots of different research methods, and hopefully an enjoyable event. I'd like to thank Eva, thank Lucy, thank you all for participating. It was a very insightful conversation. And again, I'd like to thank Asenbaum for not only making this event possible, but the whole series. So this was very, very insightful conversations over a longer period of time. And I hope I'll see you tomorrow or at another occasion soon.
a lot, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. See you soon. Bye.